Well, good morning, ye faithful remnant that are herein gathered. The kingdom of God marches on, and where two or three are gathered, there Christ is present with us, and that is our firm and faithful belief, as has been for thousands of years and counting. Today we're obviously continuing through Deuteronomy chapter 11. Last week we covered verses 8 through to 12. Here in this morning, verses 13 to 17. And we have in this particular text a very simple literary device, a Hebrew parallelism, as we often call it. We've encountered many of these before throughout our time in Deuteronomy. Of course, such a staple Old Testament text. And we come up against yet another one of these that will provide for us fertile soil, as it were, pardon the pun concerning the text of rain and a fertile land, that will allow us to be able to see the great depth and profundity, quite frankly, that lies within this particular text for us this morning. There is, of course, as I'm sure you may well be able to tell for those who were here last week, a flow-on effect or confluence in regards to these agrarian motifs that Moses is herein applying during this section of the speech, this ending of the first speech of his. We saw much of last week on this concept of the land of milk and honey and the rain from heaven and these kinds of very deep and powerful symbolic and typological motifs. This aspect of rain and blessing also then continues to flow forward into this particular text. And so much of what you will have heard on that specific respect last week will provide good background for your understanding here today. But it also comes in tandem with another concept which we have seen quite often, that Moses is then adjoining in this particular point that he is making here. And this is the notion of covenant blessing and covenant curses. Okay. It's something which we've alluded to. Of course, you've heard me many times mention the fact that Deuteronomy chapter 28 is kind of the marquee aspect, not only of the book of Deuteronomy, but also of really the whole scriptures that enumerate and elucidate this concept. The first half of that chapter is more or less dedicated to God explaining what will be the benefits or the blessings that come about from obedience to God and the blessings, right? The covenant faithfulness, as it were. And the latter half is then, of course, diametrically opposed to that. In contradistinction, it is the curses, that will come about as a result of unfaithfulness. We've seen many times throughout Deuteronomy thus far, of course, that God, through the prophet Moses, reminds the Israelites in this context of his faithfulness. He reminds them in a general and abstract sense. He reminds them in more concrete examples as well that we've seen, especially in those first 4 chapters during the historical aspect that begins the book. It is the people that, as we've mentioned so many times, were unfaithful already to this particular point. And herein, flowing on through this particular concourse of the text, we have all these various aspects herein present. Much of what we're wanting to look at and focus is on the general or the universal level, what we'd call the abstract level. And there's a couple of reasons which I'll explain just shortly as to why that's the case. But that will be more of our purview as opposed to the individual. We'll focus on that a bit, only in passing. But our entire time is actually going to be spent in this passage. There's a couple of places that I will reference as we go through, such as, for example, Job chapter 38, which we had read earlier during the liturgy, during the Old Testament reading. But we won't be turning to any specific passage. Okay, so our focus will be very much heavily here in this central text in Deuteronomy 11 that we have before us today. Okay, so before we move into verse 13, this notion of the general, which I want you to understand so that you can see the frame and perspective of what we need to be able to learn and to be able to apply for ourselves. The reason why we're focusing more on the general or the universal level, okay, so groups of people, us as Christians, the body corporate of Christians, we as communities, as societies, as nations, is primarily because, of course, that is the first and foremost context. Again, we've seen very often, as has been the consistent motif, that it is the people, kind of in the general singular sense, that are who are in view as opposed to the individual. And we've mentioned many times the the errors that have come about with modern individualism and these days kind of hyper-individualism. The focus on the ego or the self very much is now the lens through which we as people, including often we as Christians, view everything else around us. It's the dangers that come when we think that we are the main character of the Scriptures. Okay, we are to learn from all of these things in the appropriate context in which, of course, they're given. Secondly, and moreover, is really in regards to application. Because of the fact that the foundation of this text is in that general or universal or abstract, we use those terms synonymously, in this particular context, to apply it in the specific can actually start to get quite shaky, okay? Especially when you talk about blessings and curses. When you try to kind of confine and kind of compress the general down into the individual or the specific, okay, you can end up misunderstanding what is actually being explained, and you'll hear that as I kind of at least touch on it in passing as we go through. Okay, so having laid that groundwork for us, let's now move into verse 13 of our passage here in Deuteronomy chapter 11. Verse 13, "And it will be that if you listen obediently to my commandments which I am commanding you today." Now we've heard this phrase many times before. Of course, Moses is not speaking in his own right authority. He is the mouthpiece of God. So when he says my commandments, he is not the source or the origin of these commands. When he says my commandments, they are God's commandments. Moses has no other commandments other than that which God gave him, of course. "If you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul." This is, of course, the summary of the first table of the law. We're very familiar with this phrase, of course, the first great commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And the second is like the first, love your neighbour as yourself. Christ, our Lord, highlights these as the summation of the totality of the law, the vertical orientation of the law and the horizontal orientation, loving God and loving man, okay, our fellow man. In this case, he's focused on that vertical, the hierarchical aspect, okay, the upward and transcendent aspect, loving the Lord God. And we have connected many times, in fact, quite recently, just earlier on in this very chapter, when we looked, technically speaking, at the very first verse of Deuteronomy 11, where we saw that love is defined by doing what is good. Okay, it's not merely an emotion or a feeling, that's auxiliary and accompanying, of course, but love primarily is action, be it in word or deed, okay, but action nonetheless. It is also then defined, what is that good? Well, it is obedience to the law of God, the divine law, okay, natural law. Law equals goodness, and goodness equals love. We've seen that, and if you want to revisit that, of course, you can find that sermon. In this case, if you obey, right, if you listen obediently, that is to say, to my commandments, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul, that I, the Lord, will give rain for your land in its season. Okay? So this is where we're seeing cause and effect already starting to develop in this particular passage. Okay? Input and output on the far side of that. Listening obediently, in other words, for simplicity's sake, obeying. Okay? Obeying the law of God, obeying the commands of God, obeying what is good as defined by God, right, by divine right. That will indeed give rain for your land in its season. Now again, we touched last week on this notion of rain and waters, and it's a symbol of blessing, of course. Okay, there is the concrete or the material aspect to that then contains within it that deeper symbolic, what we call the spiritual meaning. We often see, of course, Christ do this, where he points to various aspects of the Old Testament that touch on the letter of the law, as we might say in English, and he then hearkens the people unto the deeper meaning, the spirit of the law, as we would say. Okay? This very same construct, Old to New Testament, we, of course, are applying here in our context as recipients of the greater and newer covenant. I, the Lord, will give rain for your land in its season, the early and late rains, okay, referring to seasonality, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil. Now, we've actually touched in recent chapters on this notion of wine and oil. We saw wine featured last week in our reference to Joel chapter 3. We've touched on the significance of, symbolically speaking, of oil, okay, especially in regards to spiritual blessing and anointing, okay, in the literal sense, right? Priestly authority, we've touched on those things going through, so we're not going to take up much time here with that today. But what I want you to see as you zoom out for us and look at verses 13 through 15, we have our first kind of subsection of today's passage. Okay? We have the cause and we have the effect. We have the action and we have the byproduct. Okay? Input, output, I'm using these various terms, of course, synonymously. The action, the input in verse 13, if you listen obediently to my commandments. Okay? This is the action, and then the consequence, verse 14 through 15 ultimately. And I, the Lord, will give the rain for you, so give the rain for your land in its season, the early and the late rains, that you may gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil, and I will give grass in your fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. Okay? Covenantal faithfulness on the part of God's people brings about blessings from God. Okay? Not in a transactional sense, however, and this is what we're going to need to start to build upon and to understand, and we'll build more on this understanding once we work our way through to the latter portion, verses 16 and 17 shortly. Okay? But I want you to first see this parallel that's building. We've got the first half of this parallelism. Okay? In this case, obedience resulting in blessing. Okay? Blessing from God. Material blessing here in the context, and again, of course, as well simultaneously, not to the neglect of, but simultaneously reflecting and demonstrating spiritual blessing. Okay, as we've touched on, as I said many times throughout Deuteronomy thus far. Obedience results blessing. Moving through to verse 16 and 17, we then get the second half of this parallel that will then allow us to establish the foundation upon which to build here. Changing course, he says, verse 16, beware lest your hearts be deceived, and you turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Why? Apart from the obvious of it violating the law of God. Well, verse 17, the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens, so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord is giving you. So between verses 15 and 16, we see a pivot, of course, here on the part of Moses speaking, of course, the word of God, and we get a change in direction from bright, summary, lovely concepts like blessings and rains and being able to grow and to harvest new grain and wine and oil and of course the cattle being cared for and fed, and we in turn eating and being satisfied, to a much more darker, seemingly macabre sentiment. Beware, right? Be on guard, right? He's calling the people to be warned. Beware lest your hearts be deceived and you turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Okay? Be on guard. And we've touched on this specific concept many times before, so we're not specifically focusing on this one sentence here today. But beware lest in your hearts you are deceived. Okay? Lest your hearts, your spirit be deceived. Lest it be led astray. Lest it commit the same apostasy, okay, the same departure from the faith, the same turning away that many of your own, from their context, fathers and even in some cases grandfathers undertook, as it were, who indeed did turn away. This is this literal term of apostasis, right, to apostatize, to abandon the faith, and serve other gods and worship them. Of course, we've touched many times famously upon the infamous incident of the worship of the golden calf, as it were, back during the time in which Moses the prophet was upon Mount Sinai. And why is that the case? Well, verse 17 is the consequence. So verse 16, action, just like we saw in verse 13. Then bringing about consequence. Consequence, verse 17. The anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. Okay, the anger, the wrath, okay, the fury. There's various different terms that we find throughout the scriptures that are then translated across into English, anger kind of being the most common of these. Divine anger, anger that is built upon a violation of justice. This is not anger that is to be confused with the kind of explosive emotional anger that we as mankind are prone to at times. It is righteous anger, as we might say, often in English terminology. Okay, it is the anger that comes about as a result of evil, of witnessing evil, of being in the midst of evil, of having evil done against you or done to those whom you love, etc. Okay, there is a place, of course, for anger. Generally speaking, throughout history, one would not need to explain that. But in our time, anger is almost seen as a universally sinful or wrong practice of some kind. It is seen as something that in all contexts is a no-no and is warranting of a slap on the wrist in some particular form, proverbially or literally. The problem largely in our time, just as a very brief point on this particular phrase or word that we have here, is that we're not angry enough, quite frankly. We do not have anywhere near the scale or scope of righteous anger at evil that we otherwise should have. It is through the, quite frankly, propagandization against the concepts of divine justice and of a holy or a righteous anger that have left us largely apathetic and neutered in the religious sense as well as particularly the civic, where so many great evils abound and such little action is ever taken. Now again, the anger must be reasonable, the anger must be justified, in the literal sense, righteous, justified. Our Bible study students are familiar with the fact that those are synonymous terms in the scriptures, okay, righteousness and justice. And it also must be the same kind, again, of that of God. It must be premised upon the same bases in which his own divine anger or divine wrath is based. But the abandonment of this as not just merely a category, but really as a reality, is something that has been almost universally negative for us as a people, as modern Christians. Not just here, I'm talking about really around much of the West at this particular point. It is the lack of anger that demonstrates what is the deeper issue, which is a lack, ultimately, of spiritual care. It's just a lack of care. It's not caring enough. It is compromise in morality, it's compromise in ethics, it is compromising ultimately with evil. That this thing or this program, this action, this particular thing, whatever happens to be in reference, is really not that bad. And it's in that chasm of downgrade and compromise in which the greater evil actually occurs, and that is the silence in the face of that evil. It's the compromise with it. That goes not only in the individual level, it goes even on the greatest and most general of levels. It's something that we should hearken ourselves unto in our time. But nevertheless, moving forward, the action, the input of deception and of turning one's heart away and serving other gods and worshipping them, bringing about and resulting in the anger of the Lord being kindled against us. Indeed, he will shut up the heavens, okay, in contrast and contradistinction to what we saw, of course, in verse 14, that I, the Lord, will give rain for your land in its season. In this case, the opposite occurs. The shutting up, in other words, the closing of the heavens, the closing off, so that there will be no rain and the ground will not yield its fruit. This is why throughout human history, universally, and I do mean that, famine and drought have been seen, quite understandably so, as signs of divine judgment, even among the pagans. Okay? Now, there is aspects in which drought, of course, is seasonal, but prolonged instances of drought and of famine that come about as a result of this is signs of God's judgment. We often tend to think of judgment, even just before as we transition here into some of the larger points for ourselves here today. We often tend to think of God's judgment as a merely spiritual thing that is reserved for the day of judgment. That's the temptation, at least, is to think of the judgment of God as something that happens in the future at some particular point. Problems really, there are many with it. But the fundamental problem with it is that it utterly fails to understand so much of what actually occurs throughout the Scriptures. If one's view is that the judgment or judgments of God are reserved merely for the spiritual, A, and B, for the future great day of judgment in which all the world will be judged, you cannot make heads and tails, quite frankly, of the judgment that befell the very generation that apostatized in the wilderness. You cannot make account of all the instances of apostasy during the days of the United Kingdom and even the divided kingdoms, during the reigns of Jezebel and other such infamous figures. You cannot make heads and tails, especially of things like the Babylonian exile. If indeed judgment from God is only spiritual, so abstract, and is only for some future event, you really have no way of ever meaningfully understanding large swaths of the Scriptures. It is something we also must be wary of avoiding. Judgment indeed occurs in this world. It is not an either or, it is in fact a both and, as we would say. God indeed brings judgment in and through and by the world. This is, of course, the instance of the great deluge, the ancient flood itself. God brings judgment in our lives individually. He brings judgment more particularly so in the general, the corporate sense, or the national sense, the civic sense as well. This is, of course, the kind of instance that's being referred to here, as I mentioned in the introduction. But judgment indeed occurs in this world. And so what we've got here now for us is the two parallels, the two sides of the parallel, I should say, that exist for us. Okay, the first side, in which you have verses 13 and 14/15, obey God, and he will bring blessings. Okay? He will sustain you, he will maintain you, he will nurture you as a caring and loving father. Disobey God, abandon God, follow after and worship false gods, and do evil, and God will bring judgment upon you. Action, consequence, action, consequence. One direction, the other. The famous ancient analogy of the two paths, as it were. One leading one direction, the other a different way. Now in this context here, of course, we see this general level, the universal, the abstract level, as I was referring to in the introduction, that is playing out before us. And we see that most particularly, of course, through this ending of verse 17, the final clause of that judgment is not just merely the shutting up of the heavens, not just merely the physical consequences in terms of economy and business and all these kinds of other aspects that, of course, would tie into the land in ancient times. But also, as it finishes, you will perish quickly from the good land the Lord is giving to you. There is actually an ultimacy that is herein at play. There is a finality that if such things do indeed prolong, you will perish from the land. We, of course, saw an instance of this, as I mentioned just earlier, in the Babylonian exile, in which the vast majority of the people were indeed slaughtered. You had elements that were sold into slavery in Egypt, kind of a full circle fulfillment in the most dire and tragic senses of 1,000 years of history almost, more about 800 years, in which, having been freed from slavery in Egypt, they now returned a portion of them back into slavery in Egypt. We don't hear from these Israelites until, of course, the day of Pentecost, in which those who had come from Alexandria, those who had come from Egypt, now formed a part of the foundation of the church. Okay? So God brought redemption for that faithful remnant ultimately in the end. But the people were largely destroyed, and this is indeed, again, you will perish quickly from that good land that the Lord is giving you. There are real dire consequences that come. And we see how this plays out as well. The Babylonian exile, the great judgment as God used the might of the ancient Babylonian Empire to destroy the kingdom of Judah, which was the one that was left by that point, came after centuries and centuries of evil, centuries of decadency and decline and devolution, as it were, socially and morally and religiously. Times by the time you get, of course, to the beginning of that 6th century BC, where God is all but gone and forgotten in the minds of the people. The temple is largely in ruins. The very book in which we're reading, Deuteronomy, is gone and essentially lost. It had been ever so briefly found and restored under one of the penultimate kings, Josiah, one of the last kings, who found the book, one of his courtiers, in the rubble, literally lying in the dirt. The very book that we have that we're reading before us right now. This is the state of apostasy. The abandonment of God, the worship of demons, and of the conducting of great evils, of child sacrifice, of temple prostitution, etc., etc. Actions, consequences. In one, of course, of two directions. Faithfulness and blessing, abandonment and destruction. Now, there is, of course, more than just merely the personal dynamic that is going on here. That is to say, there is more than just a legal aspect. What do I mean by this? In this particular case, of course, we've already touched on this notion of law or the commandments we see at the beginning of verse 13. And it will be that if you listen obediently to my commandments, which I am commanding you, that you love the Lord your God and serve him with all of your hearts and your souls, that the Lord will give you rain in its season. Okay, there is a legal aspect which is tied to this, and much of this notion of covenant is, of course, in that legal aspect. Right? God is making a covenant, right? The highest form of a treaty, as it were. It's more than that, but it's the highest form of it, in which between he and his people, here is what I will do, here is what you will do. If you do this, this is what will happen. If you don't do this, this is what will happen. That's exactly what we have before us. But there is a deeper reality to this particular passage, and really the concept of covenant faithfulness in general, that lies underneath the legal aspect. Again, not in contradiction of it, but both and. Okay? And that is the very nature of reality itself. It's so very important for you to see this. We've touched on this, of course, a number of times. But the metaphysics of God and of the world which he has created, that is to say, the nature of reality, is very much at play here in this particular text. It is not only or merely because of this legal aspect as God has made a covenant with his people. It is also because of the very basis of the created order of the world itself. Many years ago, we looked specifically at those early verses of Genesis chapter 1, the very beginning of the Bible. And we saw how in that primordial time, God created the very material fabric of the universe. And it existed in this state of, in the Hebrew, tohu vabohu, the void and emptiness. It was this ancient chaos. Okay? And then out of that chaotic matter, he made the world and the universe and all that we know and see, including us, ourselves, humanity. That primordial chaos, God ordered. This is the very origin of our world. It is the origin that is then described in Genesis chapter 1. Out of chaos came order, and order was made out of chaos. There is a way in which God has ordered the world to operate. There are fundamental principles that undergird the very fabric of the world and of our very lives and of the human condition and the human experience in the world, of everything that you see around you, nature itself. This goes for not only the natural laws which govern the world, which govern the rains and the winds, which govern the sun and the moon. But indeed, in terms of the human experience in the world, there is very deep and profound philosophical realities that exist in that very same vein. That when we violate the order of God's world, what do we have left? We have chaos. And it is chaos that, of course, will abound. Chaos itself is not a force in its own right. Chaos is the absence of order. Where there is no order, there is, by definition, chaos. Just as, of course, it is with light and with darkness. Where there is no light, there is darkness. Where there is good, there will be no evil. And where there is no good, there will be evil. It's the void that is left. Just as, of course, in that ancient times there was the empty void of that primordial state that God then ordered and brought about the very fabric of creation as we understand it. In that same exact vein, when there is not order, and the divine order particularly, all we are left with is the void and the emptiness of chaos. And so far deeper than just the legal aspect of if you do this, I will do this, and if you do that, I will do that, beneath that very real level, that very real construct, is the order of the world. That if we abandon the divine order, if we abandon the true reality of how God has created the world to operate in goodness and in truth, then all we will be left with is the empty and chaotic void of its absence. And so it's not only or merely that there are legal, judicial repercussions for evil. On top, or really undergirding that very real truth, that most obvious reality, is the fact that the violation of order naturally results in chaos. It is the consequence, the inescapable metaphysical consequence of abandoning the order of God's created world. This is why it is inescapable. This is why empires have risen and fallen every single time. It is why great kingdoms have come and great kingdoms have gone. It is why you have seen historic rises of the most famous of men throughout history, and in other instances you have seen cataclysmic falls from heights beyond which we are often capable of conceptualizing. Because at the end of the day, if one is not living individually all the way up to nationally at the level of God's order, all that will come will be chaos. And the chaos itself is the judgment. It is the consequence. Action, consequence. Input, output. You do this, and this will happen. In the case of our text, that we see here, if you listen obediently to my commandments, in other words, if you abide by the divine order, if you remain faithful and following the righteous path of the way that God has designed us as human beings to live and to flourish in relationship with Him, in covenant with Him, then indeed, ultimately, you will be provided for, you will be sustained. God will guide you, He will lead you. It does not mean you will end up in a palace, but what it means is that even in your lowest moments, you will never be abandoned by Him. Order will be maintained. However, if one is to do the opposite of verse 13, which of course is verse 16 primarily, beware lest your hearts be deceived and you turn away. So you turn away from obedience to God. You turn away from the divine order. You turn away from the reality of how God has designed the world to work and for us as human beings to live. Then indeed, not only will his anger be kindled against you, but there will be physical consequences, which will ultimately lead to your destruction. And this goes, as I mentioned in the introduction, from the individual all the way up to the largest of levels, entire people groups, entire nations. Now, part of our lack of focus on the individual is because when you try and compress this general or universal level purely to the individual, you can start to mistake things, okay? As the scriptures so often say, including Christ himself, the rain falls on the just and the unjust, okay? A sign of, or your being materially blessed, for example, is not automatically a sign that it is because you are in right standing with God. It is also entirely possible that you have accrued that wealth through ill-gotten gain, right? So at the individual level, there are particulars that make a different, more specific discussion needed. But in this sense, in the context in which we have this passage, which is the general, the national level, these things are fairly simple to dissect, at least ultimately so. If a people do not live collectively in accordance with the divine will, if they do not act and operate in accordance with the natural order of how God has designed the world and humanity to operate, in goodness and in truth, then there will be chaos and the destructive consequences thereof. And indeed, it will lead to, as it says, perishing. It will lead to death. Death physically, death spiritually. It will lead to the death, again in this national civic context that we have here, the death of institutions, the death of order from the civic perspective, especially when we talk about things like law and order. It will lead to death economically. It will lead to death politically. All these various things, again, it is inescapable. You are talking here in this very ancient passage about the foundational realities of the world. This is what we have to understand. So often, I, and I'm sure Pastor Michael as well, field the kinds of questions or discussion points as to why so many of the things are going wrong in our time. Why is it? Why is this happening? Why are we seeing so many things in our culture go off the rails, many of which are only going to be getting worse across the rest of this century? Well, it is because, again, when you abandon the divine order, all you will be left with is the chaos in its wake. To not see that is the very pathway of falling into its trap and into its snare. Even us, we, and I do say even us, Australia, as descendants of the largest and greatest empire the world has ever seen, as descendants of the highest and ultimately the most Christian civilization that has ever been built, that even if we abandon God and the divine order and the natural order of the world, it would be the height of hubris to think that we would somehow be spared from consequence. Part of this, of course, naturally, seems almost universally bleak. It seems hopeless if one only ends there, of course. But one must also understand the context, again, in which this is occurring. After, in the time of the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, if indeed God had destroyed and annihilated the people for their great rebellions, of which there were, of course, multiple, the great rebellion in the days of Aaron and the golden calf, as I mentioned earlier, the great rebellion of Korah and the priesthood. Okay, so not only the people, but now also the religious leaders as well, the predominance of them. If God had have brought judgment down upon them and ended the entire project there and then, he he would have been entirely justified in doing so. These aspects are also vitally important for you to see as well. If God had have included Noah's own family in that flood, he would have been justified in doing so. If God had have annihilated the entirety of the Israelites when he brought down upon them the wrath of the Babylonians, he would have been justified in doing so. Time and time and time again, we see instances in which the judgment of the Almighty would have been justified in the face of great evil, in the total, plenary, all-consuming sense, in which none escape. However, what we do see is that through those various times of great moral crises, of great religious chaos, we see God preserve a faithful remnant through it. Perhaps the arch example of this is not even the flood, nor even the days of after the Exodus, nor even the great judgment of the Babylonians, but indeed the destruction of Jerusalem itself in the first century. This great and harrowing era in which all men, both the Judeans and even the Romans, thought the world was at its end. In which, of course, for the great many sins, including, of course, the murder of the Messiah, judgment was brought down upon the physical Jerusalem. We covered this in our church history course, some of those early lessons. The temple destroyed, of course, because now the great temple of God's people, right, as we are, Christ the cornerstone, the prophets and the apostles as the foundation, and we being built up as living stones. Destroyed with fire at the hands of the great prince, as foretold in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, as Titus and the Romans annihilated that city. Yet, however, God still faithfully preserved the church of Jerusalem. In fact, he told them as much. He said, especially in Luke's recounting of the Olivet Discourse in Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the hills, which are known as the hills of Pella, to the east of the city. And this very thing, of course, did occur. We covered it again. I'm not going to recount the whole history. But as the Romans surrounded the city in 66 AD, the church of Jerusalem, trapped therein, went, well, it's all over, until the Romans inexplicably retreated, giving a window opportunity for the church of Jerusalem to flee to the hills in the east, the hills of Pella. And they were faithfully preserved. The church that was built throughout the first century, Jew and Greek and Roman, was again that faithful remnant preserved, the apostles being the very core and epicenter thereof, of course, the church of Jerusalem being the foundational pillar. During these times of great chaos and of civilizational decay and destruction that are all the consequence of evil, the void of chaos left by the abandonment of the divine order, God remains faithful to his covenant. God remains faithful to us as his people. And so amidst the greatest depths of the abyss, the bleakest and blackest of nights in terms of the ages of peoples and of nations, we can, in humility and in faith, trust that God will save and preserve a remnant of his people through that time of great crises. Not out of arrogance, lest we confuse ourselves and delude ourselves into thinking that we would deserve it, because the remnant that is saved never deserves it. They are, to one degree or another, as complicit as their compatriots. However, the remnant is not preserved because of their faithfulness, ultimately. They are preserved because God is faithful. And that is why indeed the people here to whom Moses is speaking, this younger generation, right, the children, and in some cases even grandchildren, of those who had rebelled against God, that is why he is giving them stern warning. Of course, we see the word beware yet again. But it is why so often he is giving them encouragement and hope that God will remain faithful. The consequences are not because God has abandoned the covenant. No, it's because you have. It's because you, as the people, have. This is the consequence of your actions. Everything that is going wrong now in our nation and around the world is because of our actions. It is because for centuries we have been abandoning God slowly, progressively, and now exponentially and expansively. We have abandoned the faith of our forefathers. We have abandoned the Lord our God who was known of old. We have abandoned the very pillars and foundation upon which Christendom was built, upon which Christian European civilization was built from the ground up. It is Christianity from the bottom to the top. And when you abandon the foundation, the whole house will fall. The question is, will there still be faithful Christians to rebuild from amongst the ruins? Will there be those who have the courage, who have the bravery, who have the fortitude, who have the endurance, who have the commitment, who have the will to rebuild from the ashes? That will determine how the lives of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and following will turn out. On the one hand, we live during an age and an era of history of great civilizational crisis. On the other side, we have the advantage of living through a time of great civilizational crisis, because it's in and through these cataclysmic periods in history that come and go like the waves that rise and fall, in which the future is built, in which the very course of history is ultimately directed. Everything, even from the seeming, I say that in quotes, seeming insignificance of your individual lives, everything is another brick in that particular work. There is nothing that is insignificant, ultimately, because when all of those seeming insignificances are accumulated and added up, when it starts small, like that little mustard seed, as Christ our Lord hearkens to in the parable, that tiny mustard seed grows into a great and mighty tree that fills the whole earth. This is exactly what the very origins and genesis of the new covenant was. A time of cataclysmic civilizational struggle and crisis, in which this small little mustard seed that was the faithful remnant of the church in that time, the transition out of the old covenant into the new, grew and grew and grew, before eventually it brought the entire Roman Empire to its knees, in which the very defeat, theologically and religiously, of the gods of Rome came about, in which eventually the very emperors themselves became Christian. This is the pathway that God so ordained for us to march upon. Do not lose hope during these kinds of times, just as Moses here is calling these before him to not lose hope. He's calling them to beware, to be wary, to be vigilant, that they indeed listen obediently to the commandments of God and that they love the Lord their God with their entire being. Because indeed, if we do so, God will bless us. In our case, God will redeem us from the pit. He will remain faithful to our ancestors who were faithful to him. He will not abandon his covenant with his people, all of us across the world. During dark times the stars are able to shine, of course, the brightest. And that should indeed be our hope, that God is faithful, and that if we turn to him, order, indeed divine order, will be restored amongst our people. Amen.